Good morning. My name is Andrew Kapati-Anagabao, and I'm currently living on unceded Ohlone land called Huichin in the Chochenyo language, specifically in Oakland, California. As I said, I'm presenting today with Christy Osorio, who is currently living on unceded Ramaytush Ohlone land, colonized by San Francisco, California. This presentation includes work by our teammates Amelia All and Chelsea Schiller. We are all non-Indigenous students at the Presidio Graduate School, whose in-person campus is on Huichin Ohlone land. How do we learn with communities instead of learning about communities? Today, we're going to summarize what was a difficult and deeply meaningful semester for us and invite you all into some commitments as non-Indigenous students and practitioners living and learning on Ohlone and other Indigenous lands.
Back in January of this year, the four of us grounded ourselves in where we were at the time, middle of a global pandemic and studying on occupied Indigenous lands. From this, we decided to focus our research across multiple courses on racism as a public health crisis, specifically on anti-Indigenous racism on Turtle Island. This quote from the Urban Indian Health Institute grounded us in our work. American Indians and Alaska Natives were once the healthiest people in these lands. But as a direct result of colonization, they now suffer from some of the worst health disparities in the United States.
So we spent the semester listening to loud and powerful Indigenous voices telling truths and experiences of this public health crisis through the US violating its own treaties with tribal nations, forced dependencies on food, drugs, and other substances, invisibility, broken US promises with deadly consequences, and political disempowerment. We used Western analytics tools to uncover some of these systemic roots of these outcomes, which revealed how both private and public US institutions have intentionally created this crisis by continuing to not treat Indigenous communities on Turtle Island as people whose lives and bodies and traditions have dignity.
Now, at the time, as self-proclaimed changemakers, our reflexive next thoughts were, what do we do about this? But the deeper we listened, the more we heard a call by many voices that they didn't want well-intentioned, savior-minded solutions. In fact, these voices didn't need the complex economic policy analytics that we needed to validate what they had already known for generations. Rather, they demanded solidarity and justice on their terms. So, in response to these clear demands, we paused our main exploration and turned inward, asking ourselves, as students, business people, and policymakers, what relationship do we have to the peoples experiencing these impacts directly, especially since none of us identify as Indigenous? How do we benefit from the realities we're examining, even and especially if they come at the expense of impacted people? And what benefit or harm do we cause or exacerbate for people through this exploration?
From these very difficult, disorienting, and important reflections, we slowly re-engaged in our main search, no longer for solutions that we might force upon Indigenous peoples framed in condescending, disempowering, and often violent notions of service or charity or civilizing, but now for pathways for us students, as well as instructors and administrators, to follow as we learn on and in more solidarity with the land and the people who belong to it, to support what they have been doing for generations to liberate themselves from racist institutions and to survive this centuries-old public health crisis.
To find these better pathways, we practiced using some criteria based on transformative justice and contemporary economic analysis. For context, transformative justice at its most basic, it seeks to respond to violence without creating more violence. It can be thought of a way as making things right, getting in right relation, or creating justice together. One of the most important criteria we used is that pathways must be Indigenous-led. We understand this to mean relating to being Indigenous, traditional ways of knowing, and connected to Indigenous philosophy and principles. As an example, on the screen, you can see a Lishan Ohlone vision of restoring the West Berkeley Shellmound, as illustrated by Elder Karina Gould. Her vision is a space with native plants, a circular dancing structure for Ohlone ceremonies, and a 40-foot tall mound with a spiral path and information about the Ohlone people. Another criteria we used is reciprocity. Pathways must materially give requested and named things back to the community in culturally appropriate ways. At the West Berkeley Shell Mound, an open, freely accessible space would honor the Lishan ancestors who still rest there. It would allow for dignified rituals today and provide all people with a place to bring their families. Next, Indigenous communities must also be able to give their consent. Restoring the West Berkeley Shell Mound would be a small step towards repairing centuries of violating Indigenous bodies and lands. The West Berkeley Shell Mound, one of the oldest at nearly 5,000 years old, is currently covered in asphalt and a parking lot. These shell mounds were created by Ohlone ancestors as ceremonial and trading places and as burial sites. In 1909, there were 425 shell mounds across the Bay Area. And today, only roughly 4 can be seen, while the rest are either covered, destroyed, or moved to museums. Lastly, an important criteria we used is policy sustainability. The Ohlone vision of this place is one of rematriation, in which people do not own the land or extract it for fossil fuels or for rent money, but instead where people steward the land to balance the needs of all life, where the Ohlone dance and pray, native plants thrive, and all people here understand their responsibility to liberate all unceded Ohlone territory, Turtle Island, and the entire planet.
Towards the end of the semester, we completed our final papers and presentations as best we could, but felt like this learning transcended one artificially bound topic, one semester, and even one group of learners. Further, we're moved to reciprocate our personal emergence back to the land and its people by planting new seeds of deeper solidarity from ourselves and our entire learning community. As non-Indigenous students studying to be better practitioners in the public and private sector alongside all of you, we deeply feel an urgency to reframe our learning questions and understandings of public and private sector responsibilities to the land. So we invite and urge all of you to join a graduate student coalition that continues this learning in community and explicit solidarity. This coalition of students on occupied Ohlone land would be a community of practice committed to repairing harm that we have caused or will cause through our research, analysis, and experimentation activities, decolonizing ourselves and our higher educational methodologies and institutions, perhaps starting by urging PGS to meet our overdue Indigenous land reparations for the more than decade and a half that our educational community lived in San Francisco, occupying Ramaytush Ohlone land, and for the time since we moved to Oakland, occupying Lishan Ohlone land. We would also commit to learning in solidarity with Indigenous people beyond our temporary time as institutional students. We commit to being trustworthy and in right relationship with Indigenous people, organizations, and land. And of course, by paying our individual and even business Indigenous land taxes.
So we urge all of our peer students and instructors and staff and alumni, other partners and ourselves to take action here and now, perhaps through one of these ways. So you can join the coalition through the PGS Student Slack channel, the Coalition of Students on Ohlone Land. Acknowledge the land every time you introduce yourself in a new class or group. Listen for Indigenous voices in your classes and your curriculum. If there aren't any, directly engage your classmates and your teaching teams. Share useful information and resources with all of your student peers, your instructors, your staff, and partners. So for example, recommend to your EL partners that they institutionalize yearly Indigenous land taxes for whatever land they occupy. Think in systems and reflect about issues of imperialism and colonization. Listen and amplify Indigenous people's solidarity across the globe. This past week, Lishan Ohlone land protectors hosted a prayer gathering at the West Berkeley Shell Mound in honor of those lost to colonial violence, from the Shell Mound to Sheikh Jarrah. We learned from Karina Gold's actions of abundance, using her people's struggle as a stage for other people's struggles, including Palestinians, the Lakota, Indigenous Colombians, Kashmiris, the unhoused, Black folks, Koreans, and Asians, as well as Jews. This learning is not just in textbooks or in classrooms. In fact, the most important learning is bringing our bodies into places where other people and listening to and relating to and protecting all people and all life. Next, demand that Presidio Grad School start paying the Shumi land tax, as Andrew mentioned earlier. We'll also share in the chat where you can pay your own land tax where you live. And lastly, come up with your own way to get involved. All of these suggestions and more will be shared soon on the PGS Student Slack channel and PGS Connects. So we started this presentation by acknowledging the land and its people. And we'd like to close with the responsibilities we have as guests, as made clear to us by Karina Gold. As a guest on my land, I expect you to come with us and make these things possible. We cannot do this without the help of everyone who is here now.